Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, June 6th, 2020, and today we're going to be talking about the impact and the electoral implication of the protests and riots that are happening around the country on the 2020 election. I will say this is not going to end up being good for Donald Trump. Taking a look at the overall electoral landscape in areas that Democrats need to do well in, I didn't even get a notification, so I don't know why my MacBook went off, but in terms of the electoral landscape in the areas Donald Trump needs to retain, he is practically making angry a very strong and very passionate base. The African-American vote has never been crucial to Donald Trump's victory in 2016, so it won't be crucial to his re-election bid. However, they have been crucial for electing Barack Obama, the first black president, or electing pretty much any previous Democrat, when these Democrats are increasing turnout in areas such as the 2018 elections or 2008 and 2012 with 65 and 66% black turnout respectively. It benefited the Democratic Party. In 2016, it died down to around 59%. While being very high, Hillary Clinton lost 3 states by less than 1%. So that 6% difference from 2008 and 7% difference from 2012 did make all the difference. And it was very clear in the election results that Hillary Clinton did not drive up turnout. Donald Trump, however, is driving up turnout for Democrats. He single-handedly is handing the Democratic Party the presidency if he continues at this rate. Taking a look at the most recent NPR news poll, they take a look at the overall approval rating of President Trump, -12 nationwide. A lot different than where the landscape was just 2 months ago when people were approving of him in terms of the handling of the COVID-19 situation. On top of a global pandemic, Donald Trump is now going to be deemed responsible for the riots and protests that are happening around the country. When we're taking a look at what the nationwide view is on these, 61% of national adults and 61% of registered voters say that they view these demonstrations as protests. A lot of the time, the Republican Party and Donald Trump are trying to spin this into a point where it seems as if the riots are what's happening and not so much the protests. It doesn't seem like that is at all resembling on the American public. However, 31% of people view the demonstrations as mainly riots. So that definitely seems to be part of the, I guess you could say, solid Republican base. I wouldn't necessarily see any Democrats saying that they believe that the most of this is riots, considering the fact that the Republican Party has been the one that has been trying to, really push the All Lives Matter movement and a number of things against what the entire protests are about. While I understand the issue of rioting and how certain people are taking advantage of the situation, I wouldn't necessarily say that's representative of what the Black Lives Matter movement wants. They are not asking for these riots to happen. These are just happening at the expense of, in some cases, not even black people. If you take a look at a lot of the videos of the people who are going in and out of the stores and who are breaking down things, when you're taking a look, those are not Black Lives Matter activists. Those are people who are taking advantage of the situation and giving a bad name to the overall movement itself, which I truly believe is what Donald Trump is trying to get at. I think that he's trying to completely rewrite the entire protest idea and say that this is something that is turning into a riot. And I don't think that's going to help him. I don't think him taking the protests and trying to directly correlate them to the riots, while the riots may come up as a result of a number of people altogether and people taking advantage of the situation, I don't think that's the purpose of these protests. I think the purpose of these protests are to be treated equally from the police force and from the justice system and just essentially for equality nationwide. I will not say that these riots are any resemblance of what the Black Lives Matter movement wants, but that's what I think Donald Trump is trying to do. Effectively, he's trying to intentionally divide the nation, and that's exactly what worked in 2016. Divisiveness was, though, at the forefront of both campaigns, is definitely turning off into more of the Donald Trump side of the 2020 election. Donald Trump has been tweeting, and the American public sees it as well. They do believe that Donald Trump tweets to divide and not unify. 65% of voters say Donald Trump's tweets are not aimed at unifying the country. Only 35% agree with that statement. In terms of all of the Republican opposition to President Trump, either they're staying silent or, like General James Mattis said, Donald Trump is actively trying to divide the nation. And whether that was a campaign strategy that worked in 2016, us versus them mentality, and it did work, but moving ahead to 2020, it doesn't look like this is going to work. Now, what's about to appear on your screen is not an electoral map. This is a shift based off of the riots and protests that are continuing and Donald Trump's comments and how I believe they will impact the electorate. On your screen right now is a shift of left and right, and pretty much where I think these states will be moving in favor of the Democratic Party or in favor of the Republican Party. Now, when you see a safe state, a safe Democratic state, I'm not saying this state is going to shift 15% to the Democratic Party. What I'm saying is that this state itself may have higher or increased African American turnout, which in turn will benefit the Democratic Party. This is not talking about the margins. This is more so talking about the direct impact of Donald Trump's comments and the numerous riots and protests. And keep in mind the Montgomery bus boycott occurred for over a year. Okay, MLK fought for this, fought for civil rights for well over a year. It wasn't just a week long of protests in major cities. This was a fundamental grassroots change movement, and we could likely see this move up even past the election. I don't think that this is going to all of a sudden disperse just because of the fact that Donald Trump is bringing in the National Guard, which militarizing the police force and bringing in literally the National Guard into major cities. I don't think that's going to benefit him whatsoever. I do think that there will be some areas that will have a positive reaction to it, areas that were pretty solid for him and don't have anywhere near a very large African American population. A number of the states over here are 1% or less in terms of black representation in the state, not necessarily representation, but demographic wise. And some of these Democratic states I don't necessarily think are going to change much in terms of the way that they vote in this election. For example, Washington, Oregon, New Mexico, Hawaii. These are all states with very small African-American populations, so it wouldn't necessarily make sense as to why increased African-American turnout would necessarily negatively impact this. And I also think that there will be an increase amongst white voters who were maybe on the edge about voting for Donald Trump again or didn't vote in 2016 that may come out and vote. And I think that there will be, if you take a look at the South, a number of African-American voters that are going to be outraged. Tennessee has 16% of their population black, Mississippi 37%, Louisiana 32%, Maryland 30%. While I do think that these states are probably going to vote Republican and Democrat pretty solidly, I do think that increased African-American turnout could narrow down the race. Mississippi was a 10-point margin in 2008 and almost a 20-point margin in 2016. That was, again, due to that 7% of lost African-American turnout in a state that has the highest minority composition nationwide. 37% of Mississippi citizens are African-American. Based off of that, you would maybe think Mississippi would be a swing state in this election. I don't think so, but I do think that it will narrow down, and I do think that the direct impact of Donald Trump's comments are going to outrage the African-American base. This voting bloc, which hasn't voted in full force in a number of elections, the only time that ever you could really say full force, probably never. The white electorate, however, number one, they also have a lot larger of a population, so African-American turnout needs to come out in full force if there is to be a major wave amongst voters. They are only 13% of the American demographic, whereas white voters make up over 50%. So when you think about that, again, it may be very difficult for African-American voters to make a direct impact nationwide, but I will say that in a number of these states, their increased turnout will, number one, be a worry sign for the Republican Party. The 2017 Senate special election was not won just on the backs of white voters in Alabama. There was increased turnout amongst all of those Bible Belt Democratic counties that pretty much range across the entire South. That is the only key area that is likely or safe Democrat in terms of my trends, because they are going to see a very sudden spike and increase of Democratic voters. I don't think it's enough to flip the states. Same thing in Georgia. While I do think that there will be a very large African-American population a spike in terms of turnout, I don't think that it's going to be enough to flip the states. Sorry about that. My screen recorder cut out, and I also fixed the overall cropping of the video, but what I was just saying, that Donald Trump, I do think, by intentionally dividing the nation and making it an all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter movement versus peaceful protesting and rioting, I think that it's going to, number one, it's just going to negatively impact him. But number two, I do think that in some areas, such as Montana and Idaho and Wyoming, in areas that don't have a very strong African-American population, I'm talking 1-2%, even in some states, I mean, Montana, 1.27%, somewhere around there. Very, very low. 4,000 people in Montana consider themselves to be African American. So when we're talking about that, it's not going to positively impact the Democratic Party there. The Trump base probably will be outraged just because of the fact that they are, number one, going to agree with the comments that he makes. So I do think that this may end up bringing over some Republicans who don't necessarily have African-American friends or don't necessarily see the direct impact of this because there is no very large African-American base. They can't really necessarily experience something that doesn't happen in those states particularly. Whereas states in the South where African-American voters have seen active voter suppression in states such as Georgia or active movements against them in history, I will say that's going to definitely anger the base. Donald Trump single-handedly landed the Democrats a victory in 2018. The Democratic Party has pretty much ridden their entire campaigns for the past 4 years on getting out Donald Trump, and it's working. And that's the problem that I think that Donald Trump is going to have to realize. His divisiveness, while may have worked in 2016, creating a movement that was very different than what the Republican Party had even seen, knocking out primary opponent after primary opponent, knocking out Hillary Clinton in the general election, the Democratic Party capitalized off that now. What Donald Trump used to work in 2016, his comments that he said in 2016, while may have inspired some voters, are now inspiring Democratic voters. If you take a look at any of those ads, they're taking clips from 2016, April 2016, July 2016, his RNC speech. They're using it. This is stuff from 4 years ago that the Hillary Clinton campaign couldn't have used because there was no situation like this happening. There was no general push for police. There was, but there was nothing like this where we saw every single state protest within the same week. From May 25th on. Before that, there was no discussion about this. Yes, there was always a discussion about equality in terms of treatment from the police and the justice system, but we have never seen a type of movement very similar to what we saw in the 60s. So while Donald Trump may necessarily be dividing the nation, that is not going to positively impact him. When we look at the states that, even in the Rust Belt, I don't think that the Democrats are going to all of a sudden outperform a lot better. Wisconsin only has a 6% African-American population, which is generally around the Milwaukee area. So I think the Democrats are going to try to focus on very large population centers with large minority populations, but there will only be a limit to some of those states. While I do think that Donald Trump's comments may positively impact Democrats in the South and pretty much everywhere across the country, it may or may not be enough to flip states. Keep in mind, just because there are 37% African-American population in Mississippi doesn't mean that all 37% is going to turn out, but I do think that there will be an increased turnout. I think Mississippi will move over from a safe state to a likely state. Same thing with South Carolina. While Georgia, I do think that there will be increased African-American turnout. I also think there will be increased white turnout along with a number of these other southern states as well. These are states that voted very solidly for Donald Trump, so I'm not saying that these are by any means going to the Democratic Party, but I do think that there will be a shift, and I think that the shift will benefit the Democratic Party pretty much nationwide. Disregarding some of these states, taking a look at these other areas, I think that Donald Trump's recent comments are just going to continue to pile up and snowball into a loss for him on Election Day. And I think that's exactly what the Democratic Party is hoping for. While these protests may end up resulting in something before or after the election, this will be discussed up until November. This wasn't really discussed 2 weeks ago. I did not make a video about this 2 weeks ago. I wasn't even thinking about making a video about this 2 weeks ago because it wasn't happening. But now there's being a push from, number one, Vice President Biden as a presidential candidate, from senators, from representatives, from people who are working in Washington for change. And realistically, I think that something is probably going to happen. But again, it's going to come as a result of these protests and these things that are happening nationwide. And right now, it doesn't look good for President Trump. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'm not necessarily going to have an electoral map because, again, if the election was held today, Donald Trump would still probably lose. I just recently released an electoral college projection, but you can see how if Donald Trump is losing more voters in some of these states, how they could end up flipping. I don't think necessarily I need to make an overall electoral map because, again, that's assuming that this does continue until November. But that's again, yet to be seen. So I'm just going to give you guys this little trend map. Pretty much, it's just lean, likely, safe for the Democrats and only lean for the GOP. Again, Donald Trump's comments are only hurting him at this point. They may benefit him in some, middle America states, but not necessarily. So again, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. If you have any questions, I'll be sure to respond to them because this is a very hot topic right now and definitely needs a lot more clarification than just this, 10-minute long video. But again, please consider subscribing if you haven't already, if you want to join as a member on my channel. But again, that's completely up to you. But yeah, so again, thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you all tomorrow.